Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Right, let's bring in then our conversation and turn our attention to Anthony Gardner, who joins us now, who served as US ambassador to the EU between 2014 and 2017 under President Obama. Ambassador, good morning, and thank you so much for joining us. You are currently a senior advisor at Brunswick Group. I know that you've hopped straight from Bloomberg Television to Bloomberg Radio, so I really appreciate it. I could not listen in to TV, so perhaps I'll be asking you some of the same sorts of questions, but I know that our audio audience would really like to understand from you, in your role as you had it, how you see the situation now with Donald Trump in the White House saying that US tariffs will definitely be imposed on the EU. Is that your expectation? We've seen a flip-flop on Canada, Mexico, Colombia, but tariffs imposed on China. Where does the EU stand in this?
Well, it's great to be on the program. I suspect that, yes, he will impose tariffs on the European Union because he bears a special animus against the European Union. He's described them as worse than China but smaller. He's particularly unhappy with the German trade surplus and a number of other countries that rated trade surplus. And as we all know, he believes trade surpluses are evidence of cheating. So I think he is going to impose tariffs on the EU, and I think it's a very sad mistake because when I was in office, and by the way, during many Republican administrations, the focus was on reducing trade barriers and not creating more of them. This time, the European Union is more prepared than it was last time. It's got lists of retaliation that it can put into place pretty quickly. Its trade toolkit, as they call it, is much stronger than it was in the first term. The EU will want to negotiate. It will negotiate. It did in the first term, but will try to promise and assuage Trump by buying more American goods, including, like last time, soybeans and LNG, probably throw in a bit of defense and weaponry, but that probably will not be enough. It will try to say to Donald Trump, look, we're doing more on trade, on defense, which is what you wanted us to do. Look at the statistics. We can work more together on a positive agenda on China, on export controls, on supply chain resilience, and writing world trading rules and standardization organizations. None of that, I think, is going to be enough for Donald Trump. So I suspect we will see tariffs, which are going to have a very negative effect on many, not only exporters, but on manufacturers.
President Trump has characteristically been highly vociferous in his criticisms of that trade deficit with the EU. But from your perspective, as someone who was very closely involved in transatlantic trade negotiations during your term, are any of his complaints about the trade relationship between the two blocs warranted?
Well, in some instances, the EU has tariffs higher than the United States. But look, what he doesn't say, it was pretty obvious, is the United States has tariffs in some instances higher than the ones that the EU places. Yes, it is true that the EU's agricultural market is relatively closed. But what he doesn't mention, which is also obvious, there are many parts of our economy in the United States which are pretty closed, too. I'm thinking of public procurement, the Buy American and Buy America, maritime trade, coastal trade, which is the Jones Act. There are many other areas which this administration never mentions. It is false to say the EU is a completely closed market. It's still relatively open. On public procurement, I would argue it is more open than the United States. So, we can go back and forth on a ping-pong, discussion of who's more open and who's not. But what's fundamentally false is to say that when a country runs a trade surplus with another country, that means it is cheating. It's just not the case. There are many other reasons why the United States runs a massive trade deficit with almost the entire world, and it has nothing to do with who is cheating and who isn't. So my view is we should be putting more efforts into addressing specific, arguments about, certain tariffs, making trade liberalized, and not just on tariffs, by the way. There are a lot of things that we can be working on to facilitate trade transatlantically with our best partner. And by the way, one of the things that Trump doesn't like, and here I would agree, is that in some instances, countries are not respecting a high degree of protection, whether it's on labor or, under the Obama administration, it was the environment and IP. Those are the kind of restrictions that we should be tearing down to ensure that that there's a level playing field.
But reasoned arguments have not particularly worked. What has worked is caving to a very transactional relationship. If you look at the phone call between Sheinbaum and Trump, or between Canada and the US, that is what has actually worked. What would be the most effective pain point for Europe to target Trump with if it wants their message to be heard?
Well, services trade. The U.S. runs a surplus with Europe on services. It runs a deficit on goods trade, but services is the opposite. So no doubt the EU is looking at services trade. If it really, really wanted to get tough, it could do something on procurement, because this is a massive market in Europe and is relatively more open, I think, than the United States. Could say, look, if Americans, the U.S. companies want to participate in the massive public procurement market in the EU, you have to drop tariffs. That gets pretty tough and aggressive. I think they want to avoid that, but it's there.
And let's assume for a moment then that the tariffs do get imposed in some form or other on EU goods. A lot of them are, the goods that the EU exports to the US are extremely popular. I'm thinking here particularly of, say, cars. What impact do you expect that they would actually have? Will US consumers stop buying European cars?
Well, no, the picture there is extremely complex, as you know and your listeners know, because a lot of European manufacturers actually manufacture cars in the United States. So it depends on the manufacturer in question. Some are more exposed, partly because they are importing both cars and car parts from Mexico and Canada and so forth, so they may get impacted more. Some European manufacturers do indeed export cars from Europe to the United States, but more and more, many of them have been making significant number of cars in the United States. So, yes, there will be a shift to probably more production in the United States. A few manufacturers have made those announcements recently. But that doesn't mean that, tariffs, yippee, these are great things, more jobs in the United States, because over the longer term, it makes us less competitive and it will make prices rise. Tariffs are a regressive tax. A tax that the least well-off pay more in general. So it'll be interesting to see when people actually feel this in their pocketbook. It may not be immediate, but it will happen.
In terms of the UK, do you think that Britain is really going to be excluded? Or is it a matter of time? Is it something that comes in perhaps further down the line when the US looks at this? I mean, the government at the moment is trying to focus on the advantages of being both close to the EU and the US. There's obviously an argument that the UK could end up isolated by these massive kind of partner trading blocs. What's your view on the UK now?
Well, yeah, I don't agree with that argument. There was a lot of comfort that the UK had for being inside a big tent. And it's not only because the EU is an effective trade negotiator and can get much more leverage in the trade negotiations. Look, we saw it recently with the Mercosur. We saw it recently with the EU's updated agreement with Mexico. The EU is negotiating a lot of other agreements across the world. Yes, the UK is doing it as well, but the EU drives a much, much better bargain. Being inside that tent, it gave the UK a certain number of significant benefits. So the UK is now out. So, yes, it's trying to do the splits, to try to do a little bit of each. I suspect the U.S., under Trump, will say to the U.K., make a choice, either with us or against us. And by the way, that means not aligning with any of the EU regulations, but aligning with U.S. regulations on a number of issues, including on food, on agri-food. That's going to be a really difficult moment for the UK, because then it will bear a significant price in terms of goods export to its biggest market, which is the EU market. So the answer to your question is this is a really tough line to walk, and it's not without a price.
And on that, then, on the UK, again, let's assume that the Prime Minister doesn't manage to walk that very tough line, and that some form of tariffs are slapped on UK goods. What are the potential sort of pinch points for the UK likely to be? Where might the Trump administration target? And similarly, what sort of retaliatory measures might we anticipate?
Gosh, I don't want to speculate on that. I mean, we saw already last time, tariffs. I think it was on some drinks trade and so on. But I don't want to speculate on which things are going to be selected by Trump, nor what kind of retaliation there will be. So I will I will respectfully pass on that question. I hope we can avoid it because it is, as I mentioned, I think it's a destructive to a positive trading relationship.
Ambassador, just briefly and lastly, do you think that the role of US ambassadors is changing? Obviously, you know, it was a job that that you held and clearly enjoyed for a long time. Do you think that the role of US ambassadors will change under the second Trump administration?
Oh, that's a very sad question. Look, the role of ambassadors has been evolving, not just under Trump, by the way. It's been kind of a bipartisan issue for a long time. We are sending, unfortunately, too often abroad envoys who know very, very little and are there just because they gave money, contributed to campaigns or to the inauguration and so forth. This is a very, very negative trend. You know, in some cases, it doesn't matter because the relationship with a particular country is so strong that you can deal with it with professionals from the home base, i.e. Washington. But in some cases where things get heated, and obviously we're about to hit that kind of a situation very soon with Europe and potentially with the UK, you do need envoys who actually know what they're talking about and who can be the eyes and ears and be an intelligent set of eyes and ears beyond what Washington can already, gather